Welcome to the Prairie FILES, a true crime podcast. Disclaimer. Please note, trigger warning. This podcast contains graphic depictions of gruesome violence that may be alarming to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Episode 8, The Story of Bob Neville. In this episode, we travel back in time to June of 1971 in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. The streets of Edmonton looked a lot different back then, with only 430,000 people living in the city at the time compared to 1 million now. Also downtown, you would notice a matrix or a mesh of overhead electric lines, which would be used to propel electric trolley buses. And in many cases, what would happen is these probes would actually come off the tracks, so the bus driver would have to get out, pull out a big long hot stick, and reattach the contacts. The number one song at the time was Wants Ads by the Honeycomb, and I'm not gonna lie, I've never heard of this song. There was no Edmonton Oilers at the time, but there was the Edmonton Eskimos Football Club. They would later change their name in 2020 to the Elk, out of respect for the Indigenous. 1971 would be a turning point for Albertans politically, as Calgary lawyer Peter Lougheed and his PC party would win a majority, defeating Harry Strome's Social Credit Party, which had governed for 36 years before that. An average home at this time was only $22,000, while the minimum wage was $1.55. The price of oil was only $2.24 per barrel American. And at this point, Edmonton was well on its way to numerous oil booms that would shape the current landscape that we see today. This story is about the scandalous murder of Robert or Bob M.J. Neville. Bob, as I will call him in most of this story, was a well-liked, widely known businessman in Edmonton. Born in Edmonton in 1934, Bob graduated high school and ended up going to Regina's Champion College, where he would graduate. Robert, or Bobby in his younger years, was popular among his peers. He became the water boy of the Edmonton Eskimos in 1952 and 1953 and even went to the Grey Cup final with them. A letter was actually written by the Eskimos to Bob Neville's school to ask for permission for him to attend the finals. The Edmonton Eskimos players would like him so much that they even all pitched in for his post-secondary tuition. Being a great athlete in his own right, Bob won numerous awards in boxing and played junior football with the Edmonton Wildcats. Bob also had a reputation as a ladies' man, which would carry on with him throughout his adult life. Bob would end up marrying Karen Neville, and they would end up having 3 kids together. They had a little bit of a different lifestyle, but seemed to work out for the family of 5, as they got to spend a lot of time traveling, and even half the year they spent in Hawaii. During the bitter cold Edmonton winters, his wife and children would live in Hawaii, where his wife would run the Honolulu branch of Neville World Travel. Bob would hold down the fort at home in Edmonton. This would lead him to some temptations. I'm not sure what Bob graduated in, but I assume it had something to do with the travel industry, because after graduation, he got into the travel industry with Holiday Travel in 1959. He ended up at Westmount Travel sometime after that, before finding himself with the opportunity to become a partner and have controlling interest in the company. Bob, with his business associate Keith Latta, would invest in and grow the travel business together through 1964 until the name would be changed to Neville World Travel Ltd. It seemed to be Bob and his wife that were doing more of the day-to-day operations from what I could find out. In the fall of 1968, Bob got into politics. He was elected to the Edmonton Separate School Board as a trustee, and then in early of 1971, he would be defeated in a bid for the Progressive Conservative nomination for Edmonton Centre. Wayne Carroll, who was a part of his unsuccessful campaign, would quote Bob as being one of the city's most outstanding citizens. Others would say he was controversial, but he always stayed in the lanes of democracy and was always respectful. His ultimate plan was to become the Minister of Tourism. Mr. Neville sat on many boards, being a member of the Jaycees and later the Senior Chamber of Commerce, the Knights of Columbus, the Optimist Club, the United Nations Association, and the Canadian-Japan Trade Council. Neville was also former Edmonton District President for the Catholic Youth Organization. His fellow trustees would say he was hardworking, outspoken, and a bit of a maverick. The other main character in this story is Keith Latta. I don't have a whole lot of information on him. A lawyer who received his bachelor's degree at the U of A in 1955. He was slowly getting out of the travel industry, so Bob decided to venture out in his own in 1969 as a sole owner, dissolving their partnership entirely by 1971. Apparently there was some controversy with their agreements, but everything seemed to work itself out by 1971, which may or may not be true. By this time, Latta had headed out east, and he got a job as a criminal law professor at Kingston University. According to Latta, this wouldn't be the end of their relationship as they stayed good friends, he said. Latta was older than Bob by quite a bit, and according to him, he was like a mentor to Bob. Bob would apparently confide in Latta over the years about many things, including apparent extramarital affairs that would spin out of control and at times become too much for Bob to handle. According to many sources, Bob got himself into trouble with women, left and right. Latta said to police that he always tried to make sure Bob understood that he couldn't let this area of his life become unhinged, as he could lose everything, and he was starting to gain quite a bit at this point in his life. People would report a pattern of behavior with Bob. He would get heavily involved with one woman, and then he would cut them off as soon as it got too serious, only to repeat the cycle over and over and over. Latta would really enjoy putting emphasis on this, including events which would put Bob's life at risk, which may or may not have been self-serving stories for reasons we will discuss later. Bob Neville worked a lot. Most weeks it was a 7-day week grind. He kept a very strict routine. On a quiet Sunday, June 13th, 1971, Bob would leave his West End home located at 8306 158th Street shortly after 9 a.m. He headed east into the downtown area, where he would park his car behind his office and would walk over to the Chateau Lacombe, an upscale hotel that features multiple restaurants. One of those restaurants, located on the roof, rotates and is called Le Ronde Restaurant. It's actually still there today and fully functional. It takes about 88 minutes for the restaurant to fully rotate around, a 360 view. Bob ate his breakfast at the 4th floor Chevrolet Grill, another restaurant in the hotel, where he was known and liked. Eva, a hostess, was questioned by police and confirmed his frequent patronage. Bob ordered steak and eggs, and around 10 a.m., just like on many occasions, was out the door, on his way to his office just blocks away at the Corona Hotel, 10645 Jasper Avenue. This was actually a little side building that was connected to the Corona Hotel, just by a little breezeway. It was like a little alleyway. Before entering his office, just after 10:30 a.m., he stopped in at the smoke shop in the Corona Hotel to buy some cigars and shoot the breeze before settling into his office next door, according to employees of the smoke shop. He settled in and would speak to his wife on the telephone until around 10:50. Former employees of Neville would describe his Sunday routine as clockwork and religiously strict. However, on this Lord's Day, as they would call it back then, the exact sequence of events spanning the next 2 hours at Neville World Travel would be a mystery, and would at the time be the most sensational murder mystery Edmonton had ever seen. Bob Neville on this day would also suspiciously tell one of his office staff not to come in on that Sunday, which will make you ponder as the story unfolds. At about 1:10 p.m., a Canadian Armed Forces corporal would be sitting in his yellow cab waiting for a fare at the stand on Jasper Ave near the Corona Hotel at 106th Street. He would be startled by a woman who would out of nowhere would approach him asking for help. She wanted him to come with her to look into the street front office of Bob Neville's World Travel. She said it appeared a drunk man had broken in and passed out in his office face down. Concerned by what the woman was saying, they both headed towards the hotel across the street, where sure enough, they saw the legs of a man poking out between two desks inside the office. The corporal ran back to his cab to radio dispatch to call police immediately. It wasn't long until Junior Constable Satinsky would be the first officer to arrive on scene. Everything was locked up at Neville's office, so they had to go next door to the front desk of the hotel to see if they had a key. Back then, it was quite common for people to share keys for convenience and emergencies. You don't see that too often nowadays. Sure enough, they had a key and they gave it to the officer. When the constable entered the office, it was eerily quiet. He immediately went over to the man who was face down and noticed 2 blood marks on his back. It was quite obvious at this point the man was deceased. Probably not realizing what the cause of death was until he noticed a pool of blood underneath him. That's when the adrenaline started pumping for the officer. He turned the man over and would be shocked to see more extensive trauma to the man's chest. He saw the man's face and was completely surprised to see who it actually was. It was the face of a man that most Edmontonians would be familiar with, and he appeared to have been murdered. This was now a murder case. At this point, the constable's senses would have been kicked into high gear, going from a casual trespassing call to a possible murder scene with an officer even in danger. He would need to secure the scene immediately. The officer recalls being terrified, but immediately called for backup, then bravely and carefully went room to room in the office to clear them. When backup arrived, they did a further search of the building and surrounding area, and came up with nothing and no witnesses other than the woman and the cab driver who called in the initial report. Everyone on scene would be shocked to learn this was not a break-in or a drunk man passed out in the office. It was the lifeless body of Bob Neville, the 36-year-old married father of 3 and school trustee, was found lying face down in a pool of his own blood. Corporal Suka of the Edmonton Police Service would say, "It was almost like he was sleeping with his right arm under his head. The way he was lying there was just as if he had fallen over onto his face, although his head was slightly turned. It was quite obvious he had been shot multiple times at this point, with what appeared to be a .32 caliber weapon. A witness said the bullets had ripped through his body, leaving gaping wounds in his chest, in a grisly sight that most people on scene will never forget." Edmonton Police Inspector A.W.R. Lefevre was in charge of the investigation. 6 police detectives were assigned to the case, and even Interpol would eventually be involved because of some of the evidence. He said at this time there is no evidence of robbery and no sign of forced entry, to arouse speculation that the killer was known to Neville, who must have let the shooter in as the doors were locked. Authorities took pictures and collected evidence, and at about 3 p.m., Bob's lifeless body was removed from the office and placed in an ambulance. There is a famous picture taken by the Edmonton Journal that would be ingrained in the minds of many Edmontonians at the time. In this picture, 2 white shoes could be seen poking out or protruding from the covered, draped body. The sight of these shoes would almost confirm his identity to most people, as Bob Neville was known as a snazzy dresser, and his black hair was also visible at the front. Back then, it was common to wheel a dead body out on a gurney without proper shrouding. Nowadays, I believe there's a little bit of a higher standard for the way we deal with the dead. The Edmonton police initially described this as a possible professional hit because of the nature of the evidence they collected, and the murder scene was relatively neat and tidy. No desk or chairs were flipped, and there didn't appear to be any sign of a struggle. A quote, hired gun was possibly used, with police speculating bizarre possibilities for the murder weapon. Quote, it could have been flown in and out when speaking about the murder weapon. When Bob's wife Karen found out, she was completely heartbroken and would hastily organize her family's return to Edmonton. She would then fly back from Honolulu within a couple days with her children. The Edmonton police had about a half a dozen to a dozen officers at the international airport on the following Tuesday afternoon after telephone calls were received at 3 city businesses, a car dealership, a local newspaper, Neville's World Travel, all threatening the lives of Bob's family, Karen and their 3 children. When Karen and the kids returned to Edmonton, they received a police escort back to their home in Linwood. The Edmonton Journal wrote that they were from a home in Meadowlark. It was strange back then, as they would release everybody's home address if you were in the paper. The day after the murder, auditors from various airlines and steam lines would be in the office, combing through the filing cabinets, looking for anything that may be a risk to the industry or possible evidence that they can supply police with helping in the investigation. Apparently, this is common practice in the industry. After something like this happens, they need to make sure future passengers are okay and safe, and there's no weapons on any type of plane or boat or anything like that. The office was supposed to actually open the following Monday, but they had problems cleaning the bloodstains out of the carpet. 3 days after the murder, the autopsy was completed. It confirmed that Bob Neville was shot 3 times, twice in the back, once in the chest. One of the shots to the back went straight through his heart and out his chest, leaving the appearance that he was shot a 4th time. There were no indications of any bruising anywhere on the body or hands, indicating most likely no type of struggle ensued. Bob Neville's family would set up a prayer service the following Wednesday, and the funeral service was held at the Immaculate Conception Church at 108 3096th Street the following Friday. His burial was said to happen at St. Joachim's Cemetery, according to the Journal and obituaries, but I actually wasn't able to find him there. I was able to find him at the Holy Cross Cemetery on Edmonton's north end, so I'm not sure if his body was moved at some point. It's also possible that he has a marker at both locations. However, I was not able to locate him at the St. Joachim's Cemetery. At the time of burial, authorities were still puzzled as to a motive and had no suspects. They did, however, have some interesting evidence to comb through that would leave them scratching their heads. At the murder scene, they would find sunglasses, a green fedora hat, a locker key wrapped in paper that had a hand-drawn map of downtown Edmonton with an arrow pointing to a bus depot. This was the Union Bus Depot. The second page of a life insurance policy was also found in the photocopier. This locker key they found led police to locker 55, which contained various objects related to the murder, including various bullets, 22 of them live and 18 of them spent, inside a leather case. Also found in the locker was an Italian-English dictionary, a map of Italy, an Alitalia Airlines map, 2 newspapers with pictures of Neville on them, one of which was a June 9th Calgary Herald newspaper, which appeared to have been used as a wrapper, and it was wrapped around a gun holster. Police said the murder weapon would likely fit into the holster that was found. The locker was kept under surveillance for about 24 hours, but nobody appeared. Media and people from all over Canada would allow their imagination to take over, as more information would slowly be released. The police, however, were split. Some thought it was some elaborate plan of a hitman, while others thought it was just a smokescreen to throw us off and mislead the investigation. An employee of the bus depot said a daily chart showed that locker 55 had been empty up to about 9:30 a.m. the day before the murder. The day after the murder, a head-scratching phone call would ring into Edmonton Police Headquarters. An individual would insert themselves directly into the investigation. Keith Latta, Bob's business partner, would end up calling into the authorities to let them know that he had just heard of Bob Neville's murder after arriving back home in Ontario from Edmonton. He also had valuable information, he said. Latta would end up telling Officer Kosh how Neville would confide in him, and they had stayed close friends since splitting in the business. This was never confirmed as the truth, as even his wife never heard Neville talk about Latta on a personal level. As far as Karen was concerned, Keith was a business associate, and only that. Latta would go on to tell officers a bizarre story. Neville had just received an extortion threat related to extramarital affairs, which led to an illegitimate birth. They demanded $10,000. Latta said he advised Neville to go to the police, but Neville refused, he said. The problem here is the rhetoric from Latta was so strong that everything was self-serving. This would not go over well for him. According to Latta, he then agreed to help Neville by meeting with the crooks. He said they might be intimidated if a lawyer was there. Latta told Detective Kosh that meetings had been arranged between Mr. Neville, Latta, and a blackmailer in Neville's office on the evening hours of June 10th, 1971, but the meeting didn't happen because the blackmailer apparently got spooked and had seen, quote, strangers entering and leaving, and thought Neville called the police. Detective Kosh said Latta revealed that a second meeting was apparently supposed to be set up on the Sunday, June 13th, the day of the murder, but Neville never called him, Latta would say. Latta waited in his hotel room until noon for a call from Mr. Neville setting up the meeting. But Latta didn't hear from Neville, so he checked out of his hotel and left for the airport. Latta would also give another tip of his recent girlfriends Neville had. He gave two names, saying one of them could be involved in the scheme against him. A Maria and a Vera, he said, were their names. Both women would actually be found by authorities, but neither had a child, and both admitted to having relations with Neville, but not knowing of any type of scheme to exploit money. Keith Latta would actually agree to provide police with his fingerprints so he could be eliminated as a suspect. Was this a cocky move of a narcissistic psychopath, or the actions of an innocent man? On June 17, 1971, an Edmonton police spokesman would say the investigation has led them to other major cities. The police also now had a motive for the slaying. They found a partial copy of an insurance policy in the copying machine that had just been used before the murder happened. The machine was still warm and actually humming when police arrived on scene. This policy was for $37,500, payable to Keith Latta. However, in the event Bob should die of unnatural causes, he would receive $75,000. So think about that. $75,000 in 1971 would be equivalent to about $500,000 today. So it was a substantial motive. There was only one problem with this policy though. For someone to have a business policy on their business partner, there must be a financial risk associated with the business, and Latta and Neville weren't even partners anymore. So this policy should have been cancelled, as they weren't partners for quite some time. Constable Langye, or Langer, a fingerprint expert with the Edmonton Police, was able to use a silver nitrate solution to up any fingerprints on the newspaper found in the locker. 3 prints would be found: a left ring finger, a partial palm print on the newspaper section, and a partial palm on the map. These would be matched against employees of the office as well as Keith Latta's self-offering prints. Turns out they were a match to Latta. There had been some recent improvements in fingerprinting that made it easier to lift prints from soft surfaces. This was most likely not known by the killer. This would be enough for a justice to issue a Canada-wide warrant for Keith Latta's arrest. June 19th, 1971, at about 10:15 a.m., 6 days after the murder, Keith Elgie Latta, then 43, was arrested as he approached his home in Kingston, Ontario, on a charge of non-capital murder. Edmonton police detectives and Kingston police would make the arrest. Like we talked about in previous episodes, Canada doesn't usually parade their criminals around like the US. The US has their version of the perp walk. But 2 media guys were tipped off about the arrest and would hustle to Kingston to try and get a picture of the arrest. Instead, one of them by chance got a picture of Keith Latta sleeping on a train next to Sergeant Joe Poss, keeping watch as they escort him from Kingston to Toronto. This story would become national news and a great moment in the reporters' careers. as nobody else knew about the arrest warrant. And really, it doesn't really matter how they figured it out. They did, and that's great journalism. Latta now would end up spending 10 days at the Alberta hospital for evaluation before being freed on bail on July 12, 1971, spending just under a month in jail. However, on September 25, 1971, a preliminary hearing would return his bail money, and he would be remanded back into custody until the start of his trial in December. During the initial investigation, detectives would comb through Neville's office and his life with a fine-tooth comb. Many of Neville and Latta's friends would be questioned, including mutual acquaintances. Many had differing opinions of what could have happened, and because of Neville's multiple reputations, true or not, would make it much harder to put the pieces of the investigation together. There were an abundance of theories, but unfortunately, there was no proof to back these up. People described Bob as a player or a womanizer. Some would even talk about his gambling habits and even shady business dealings, while others described him as being very positive and being an intelligent school trustee and a pillar of the community. Authorities couldn't rule out even the most extreme stories, which had them searching through flight logs at the international airport, hoping to find an international link that seemed to come up with evidence found at the scene and in the locker. Staffers at Neville's World Travel report there were 2 dark-skinned Europeans that came into the office about a week earlier and seemed to lurk around and act a little sketchy, not wanting to leave. They really seemed to rub the staff the wrong way. More physical evidence would be found, as a couple walking near the Mayfair Park, now called Horlack Park, days after the murder, would find a Smith & Wesson .32 caliber revolver with the serial number filed off. They also found a black bag in the water, which may or may not have been involved. These items were found sticking out of the water about 4 feet from the Nature Walk Trail in the North Saskatchewan River. The weapon and bag became visible after the river had receded shortly after the murder. These items would be preserved for expert analysis as evidence in any court proceedings moving forward. It was also interesting to note the location of this was en route to the international airport, actually one of the only routes you would take from downtown. The preliminary hearing decided that the case will be tried by a jury of Latta's peers. On December 13, 1971, Keith Latta's 5-day murder trial before a 7-man, 5-woman jury began. A complex court case which saw overwhelming evidence against the defendant. A civil suit would also follow regarding a life insurance policy. The accused, Keith Latta, was adamant he was not the killer and maintained his innocence throughout, as he pleaded not guilty to all charges. Defense counsel Cameron Steer called numerous witnesses during the trial, including Latta's own mother. The defense would claim Neville was a victim of blackmail and extortion, and they got the wrong guy, and Latta might have been blackmailed himself. Neville's blackmail was in connection with the relationships with other women, one of whom was said to have a child by him. Latta would never actually testify in his own defense, which would raise the eyebrows of even his own followers. 2 other witnesses said Latta told them about the blackmail against Neville, but not many details were shared. A friend, William Thompson, said Latta told him on June 10th that the blackmailer had warned Neville that his life would be forfeited if $10,000 wasn't paid by Saturday, June 12th. Thompson said he had lunch with Latta and another friend, John Buckingham, on June 11th, the day after the proposed meeting with the blackmailer. He told them that he and Mr. Neville waited until 11:30 for the man to show up. Mr. Buckingham stated that he was told 1 a.m., so there were some differences in how Latta explained things to his friends. The Crown tried to debunk this as they produced a witness that said Mr. Neville and Latta were actually in the Caravan Penthouse, some nightclub. I'm kind of curious about this place now. The witnesses said they were there shortly after 10 p.m. until the penthouse closed at about 1:45 a.m. 2 women named by Latta as being possibly involved in the blackmail attempt also testified. Both admitted to having a sexual relationship and also a social relationship with Neville, but had no knowledge of any blackmail attempt and never was pregnant, nor had any child for that matter, previously stated by Latta. Defense lawyer Steer would say an enmity and hate created by Mr. Neville's relationship with other women may have promoted the blackmail attempt and his murder. He would emphasize to the jury just before closing that no one actually saw Mr. Neville, and Latta cannot be tied to the scene, even with the prints in the locker. I beg to differ. When it came down to it, though, all the evidence to exonerate Latta was circumstantial and all came from his mouth and was all self-serving. In the book, A Matrix of Evidence, that actually is about this case, they seem to emphasize the perfect frame, but I just don't see it. The Crown would argue simply Latta killed Neville for the $75,000. The Crown called London Life Insurance to the stand, and a representative would testify that on June 17th, Latta made arrangements for a loan to be between $50,000 and $60,000. Security on the loan was to have been the insurance policy of Mr. Neville's life. Latta was paid a $9,000 director's fee while being a partner with Neville. And when Latta moved to Kingston in 1968, Neville was not happy when Latta set up the auto withdrawal from Neville for $750 per month. Neville would have a court order filed to stop these withdrawals. Latta would tell the bank that he and his wife were the 2 of 3 signing authorities with the company, and after the dispute would be settled by Latta, selling his shares of the company was the only way to get out from under this. Latta had turned over his share certificate to Neville World Travel Services Ltd. In November 1969, officially ending their business relationship. So this disproves the theory that they had a great relationship. The next evidence the Crown presented would be the most damning. Fingerprints of Keith Latta were found on the newspaper inside the locker, including a partial palm print as well as the life insurance policy on the photocopier. It was page 2 of the policy. Later they found page 1 in Latta's Kingston home during a search, which actually happened during his daughter's birthday party. Police also said they believed the gun found in the river was the murder weapon, as ammunition from the locker would match this gun. A forensic identification officer would testify that 3 of the gun's 6 chambers contained fired cartridges, while the other 3 were live rounds. Neville was shot 3 times, and the Crown would emphasize this. The officer explained how close to the edge of the road it was and how it would be the only viable route for Latta to take on his way to the airport that same day of the murder, so he most likely ditched it there. They also ended up figuring out the serial number, which was actually linked to a stolen gun from Florida, and the owner of a hardware store in Florida would testify that the gun did go missing. And I did hear, I don't know if this is correct, but Latta was in Florida at the same time it went missing. The jury of 12 took 2 hours and 40 minutes to deliberate before they found Keith L.G. Latta, a Kingston University law professor, guilty of non-capital murder. As the words guilty were read out loud in court, Latta's face crumbled as he placed a hand across his face. Chief Justice J.V.G. Milvain would then speak, quote, "The law leaves me no alternative. I sentence you to life imprisonment." The justice then thanked the jury and Edmonton and Kingston police for their good job. He complimented the jury and told them he was going to increase their per diem allowance to $25 from $10. Latta would appeal the verdict a month after, but the Alberta Division of the Supreme Court dismissed the appeal the following September. During the appeal, Latta's defense claimed a miscarriage of justice when the trial judge failed to admit evidence of Donald McKinnon. Mr. McKinnon said he heard a person say in a bar that if he didn't get the travel agent, Bob Neville, someone else would. Then another twist came when Mrs. Latta would find new information that a Brazilian named Elizaldo Luis Gonçalves in fact did the killing. Interpol would end up being involved in Brazil, where Elizaldo would deny these allegations, and he even offered to come back to Edmonton to take a lie detector test. But apparently, the other side of the story is he told a whole bunch of people that he did the killing as a hit. The defense was extremely desperate, but a subsequent police investigation failed to establish any link between the Brazilian and the murder of Bob Neville. Media outlets in Edmonton would also send a couple people down to Brazil to interview the man. Latta would end up losing more credibility as his story would change a year after his conviction. Originally, he said Neville never called him to the meeting, so he never went down. But now he was saying he was in the travel office that Sunday morning. He says he and his former partner had a number of things to discuss, including Neville's fear of the blackmailer. Latta would also say that Neville was in deep financial trouble, even though this was proven not to be the case. Latta said Neville asked him to photocopy some documents at the machine down the hall. Quote, "I don't know how to operate it. Bob gave me very specific instructions about warming it up and how to insert the paper. I remember asking him to do it himself, but he insisted that I do it." Latta recalls standing at the photocopying machine and lighting one of the cigars Bob Neville gave him, which would be found by police right by the photocopying machine. Next, he would say, quote, "I heard a thump and 3 explosions. I rushed down the hall and I saw 2 men running out the door. I took Neville's pulse and knew he was dead. It was then," he says, "he saw the key to the locker. He grabbed it, then jumped into his rental car and rushed to the Union Bus Depot." He wasn't looking for the murderer, but some evidence he could give the police. To me, this sounds completely ludicrous. After going to the bus depot and checking out the locker contents, he then returned back to Neville's office, expecting to see police officers. Latta was quoted as saying, "When I got back, everything was the same as I had left it. My first thought was, I've got to get out of here. I've got to get out of this crazy town," Latta would say. He says he then left the key on the floor, yet it was wrapped in paper when the police found it. When questioned why he didn't call police originally, he said, quote, "People assume a lawyer in a traumatic situation is going to stand there and reason things out in a legalistic kind of way. It was purely an emotional reaction. I was relying on instinct. Unfortunately, one of our strongest instincts is to run," Latta would continue to tell authorities. Latta's team plea for further investigation was squashed in 1973 when the Crown decided no retrial would happen. In the meantime, Latta's family and followers were relentless in Latta's support, especially Latta's sister. She kept on writing letters and making phone calls. She got an Edmonton East MP interested in the case, and he in return drummed up support from another MP. Together, they persuaded Justice Minister Ron Basford to reconsider Mr. Latta's case. They said he was convicted purely on circumstantial evidence. A book was actually written on the case by Bruce Olson called A Matrix of Evidence. The author of this book, along with educational supervisor at Williams Head Penitentiary in BC, found nothing to support the notion that Mr. Latta was a murderer at all. Together with the help of Latta's family, they convinced the Justice Minister to reopen the police investigation, and in 1975, that was granted. In 1976, Edmonton police reopened the murder file on Bob Neville officially. A mystery woman apparently had evidence that was new and was never told in court. A Sylvia Novick would give her statement that Mr. Neville had told her that he feared for his life because of gambling debts. She would say that she told this to police in 1971, but nothing was done about it. Another twist to this emerged that Sylvia Novick would unknowingly marry the Latta murder case jury foreman, Jack Novick. Jack said after the trial, in 1972, they talked about the case, and this is when Jack would tell Sylvia to contact the police again, as she seemed to have very important information that he had never even heard. According to Sylvia, Neville paid her way to accompany him to Las Vegas. During their stay, Novick barely saw Neville, but he paid for everything apparently with IOUs. She went on to explain that the night before they left, 2 men would come to see him in their room and say, quote, "You have to pay." Then, after returning home, Neville and Sylvia were sitting in a cafe when 2 men approached. Sylvia was asked to leave while they spoke. She said after the men left, Bob was very upset and said, "I'm going to die." Novick allowed Neville to stay at her place for a few days, until she ended up just getting sick of having to deal with the issue and his paranoia. Latta had a very large following, and even CBC's Fifth Estate would cover the story, which had a lot of pro-Latta rhetoric. An Edmonton executive who was a district manager of CP Air says Bob Neville told him several times before he was shot to death that people were out to get him. Boris Onisko confirmed to the Edmonton Journal that he wrote Justice Minister Ron Basford to inform him that on at least 4 occasions Mr. Neville told him to the effect, "They are out to get me, and I don't know how much longer I'll be here." He quoted Neville as saying these words. Why didn't he tell police right away, they asked. Onisko said he didn't think Latta would ever be convicted as they were all good friends and shared a professional relationship. A 46-year-old Edmonton man also wrote a letter implementing Neville's wife, of all people. And a cab driver would also come forward saying he saw a dark-haired man running from Neville's office at around 9 a.m., which doesn't really fit the timeline. Even though more to the story was unfolding, nothing could ever be proven or substantiated. Alberta's Supreme Court would end up ruling that Sylvia Novick's statement, as well as 2 other men, would not have been admissible during the murder trial. This was a huge blow to Latta's chances of getting a new trial. Latta then made his next move. He filed a $75,000 lawsuit to recover the life insurance policy he had out on Neville. He believed it was owed to him. That trial ended up happening 5 years after Neville's death, and he had lots of time to come up with a perfect story. What made this trial so interesting is we learned even more information that was added to the story, and more importantly, Latta himself would testify this time. Latta would tell the civil court he saw the killer. The dark-haired man shot Mr. Neville, he would say. A 59-year-old barber would also come forward and testify that Neville was so desperate that he stole $175 from at gunpoint. Court dismissed Latta's insurance policy suit in 1977. Justice Moore said he did not believe Latta's evidence. He said, quote, "I am satisfied on the whole of the evidence that he murdered Mr. Neville, and London Life therefore is not obligated to pay any amount under the policy to Mr. Latta." This would be the final loss for Latta, and he would end up finishing his sentence uncontested. Even though he maintained his innocence, the parole board actually paroled him early, which has only happened twice in history for murder. Latta was released on parole in 1981 after serving 10 years, most of it at William Head Institution on Vancouver Island. By the time Latta was released, his defense counsel would have passed away. The Crown prosecutor, William Stanton, would also have passed away. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Feel free to Google his cases. He had many controversies throughout his career as a Crown prosecutor. And then finally, the building where Neville's World Travel once was in. That was torn down along with the Corona Hotel to make way for a large commercial complex. First Edmonton Place was built along with the Corona LRT station, which would link Edmonton's underground subway system. Latta remained under the supervision of Corrections Canada, living and working quietly in Victoria for the remainder of his life. Latta died on March 11, 2014, a month before his 86th birthday. That concludes episode 8, The Murder of Bob Neville. If you have any cases you'd like us to cover here on the Prairie Files, let us know below. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.